Assalamualaikum.
Assalamualaikum, how are you?
Alhamdulillah.
I'm just checking the settings. I think you're muted. Okay. So, Assalamualaikum, everybody. My name is Sarah Abuloghed, and I'm the Senior Communications Manager with the Family and Youth Institute. Thank you very much for joining us today. This webinar is inshallah titled Divorce, Stigma, Trends, and the Latest Research on American Muslims. Getting a divorce as an American Muslim may come with many challenges and little help or support. Lack of guidance may amplify the emotional and physical toll of the divorce process, and lack of support may leave people feeling unsure where to turn. In today's program, we're joined by Dalia Mogahed of the Institute of Social Policy and Understanding, who will share with us more about the public perception and stigmatization of divorce within American Muslim communities, as well as share a bit about the ISBU's upcoming report on the topic. Also joined by Rafee Al-Mansur, a marriage and family therapist in residence, and he will talk about how to grow from divorce, what he's seen in his clinical practice, and what communities can do based on what the on-the-ground needs are of the individuals seeking support. And lastly, inshallah, we'll be joined by Dr. Madiha Tahseen of the Family and Youth Institute, who will outline findings from the FYI's recent needs assessment, as well as outline some of the resources that are available in the FYI's latest publication, the Divorce Support Toolkit. Before we begin, I'd like to give a short introduction of the organizations, and then I'll introduce each speaker before they present. The Q&A feature is available during the presentation, and we will be selecting questions to answer near the close of the program. So please feel free to put your questions there as the program continues, and I'll also have a couple of reminders throughout the program. Also, if you would like, you can access the webinar on either the ISPU's or the FYI's Facebook page, where it is being live streamed. The ISPU was founded in 2002, and it has been at the forefront of discovering trends and opportunities that impact American Muslims. They are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that builds understanding and strengthens communities by laying a foundation of facts. They are the go-to source for anyone seeking information about Muslims in America and issues that impact them. They aim to share what they know in easily digestible ways with the general public, policymakers, media professionals, community leaders, and more. This webinar is also brought to you by the Family and Youth Institute, and the FYI strengthens and empowers individuals, families, and communities through research and education. The Family and Youth Institute conducts original research on the factors that promote and prevent the healthy development of families and young people. The research is then used to develop educational materials and programs and resources that can be utilized by those individuals and the community to empower and educate. Additionally, the research is used to inform community leaders, policymakers, and direct conversations about healthy and productive changes to systems and infrastructures. And this divorce webinar was also sponsored by a grant from Dar al-Hijra and is a collaborative product of both of these organizations. We're excited to be working together to address this very important topic. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce us to our first speaker, Dalia Mogahed. But I'm going to share my screen really quickly. There we go. Dalia Mogahed is the research director or director of research at the Institute of Social Policy and Understanding, where she leads the organization's pioneering research and thought leadership programs on American Muslims. Dalia Mogahed is the former executive director of the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies, where she led the analysis of surveys of Muslim communities worldwide. With John Esposito, she co-authored the book, Who Speaks for Islam? What a Billion Muslims Really Think. President Barack Obama appointed Mogahed as the president to the President's Advisory Council on Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. She was invited to testify before the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations about U.S. engagement with Muslim communities. Her 2016 TED Talk was named one of the top TED Talks of that year, and she's a frequent expert commentator in global media outlets and international forums. She's also the CEO of Mogahed Consulting. If you would like to go ahead, I'll stop sharing my screen, and you can go ahead, Dalia.
Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for being with us on a Saturday afternoon to discuss this important topic. I'm going to share my screen. What I'll be sharing today is brand new data. This is research that we have not released until right now. So this is from our 2020 national survey, and we do an annual survey of American Muslim public opinion, every single year, and it's actually not going to be released until October 1st. So this is a sneak peek specifically on the topic of divorce. We thought it was important enough to actually release some of the data early, in part because of this important discussion that we're having today. So what I'll go through today are some divorce trends in the American Muslim community, and then how they compare to other faith communities in the United States. In our survey, we ask every American, a sample of every American community, the same question. So we're able to compare directly between American Muslims and Americans of other faith and no faith. So here are the top lines. The key findings for our survey were: one, that Muslims are less likely than the general public to identify as divorced when asked about their marital status. Muslims are as likely, however, as the general public, but less likely than evangelicals to see divorce as acceptable, as an acceptable solution to a marriage that isn't working. Most Muslims, especially young people, say that they wish that the community offered more support for divorced people. And that's really why, that underscores the importance of FYI's work in providing that wonderful toolkit. And then the point, though they want more support for divorced people, Muslims are less likely than the general public to say that they would accept a divorced person as a spouse for their child. So there's sort of acceptability, there's an acceptance in general, sort of theoretically, and wanting more support. But when it comes to would you let your child marry a divorced person, that's where we see Muslims actually lagging behind the general public. And let me go through some of these findings in more detail. So first, Muslims are as likely as the general public to be married, but less likely to be divorced. And so that might sound like it doesn't make sense, but let me show you how that works. 49% of Muslims identify as married. This is 49% of the national Muslim population. And that's the exact same number as the general public. 49% say they're married. So let's just say half of the population of both Muslims and the general public are married. 35% of Muslims say they're single, and that compares to only 22% of the general public. So what is making the difference up? 11% of the general public identifies divorced. 6% only of Muslims, so almost half say they're divorced. And then 12% of the general public say they're single, but they're living with a partner. Half of that is Muslims are half as likely to identify as living with a partner, 6%. And then 3% of Muslims are widowed, and that's very similar to the 5% of the general public. So where the difference is in cohabitation and identifying as divorced. Now, the other thing to keep in mind, and that's really important to this data, is that Muslims, in terms of their average age as a community, is a full 20 years younger than the general public. So it's not surprising that they would be more likely to identify as single. They're actually just younger as a community as well. So what I take from all of this is that our community is younger in general. So we are, it's not surprising that more of us have never been married, but divorce is occurring in our community, though the rate is actually slightly lower than the general public. Muslims are more likely than white evangelicals to see divorce as acceptable. So this is a question that's asked by the CDC. It's actually a question that's tracked by government agencies just to track, social trends. And here's the question. We use the same one in our research. It's this: divorce is usually the best solution when a couple can't seem to work out their marriage problems. And then, you ask people to tell you the degree to which they agree with this statement. What you'll see here, interestingly, is 54% of Muslims agree with this. And interestingly, the most likely to agree are actually Catholics, where, as we know, divorce is not sanctioned by the Catholic Church, but they're the most likely to agree with this statement. The ones who are by far the least likely to accept divorce are white evangelicals. But Muslims and the general public are on par. This is statistically similar for 54 and 49%. Now, here's what really surprised me about the data. So Muslim young people, younger Muslims between the age of 18 and 29, that's signified here by the dark navy bar, they are as likely as older Muslims to hold the view that divorce is usually the best solution when a couple can't seem to work out their marriage problems. So in the Muslim community, there's no age difference across, there's no difference across age brackets. Whether you're 18 to 29 or you're 50 and above, you're just as likely to see divorce as acceptable. Look at what it looks like in the general public. It's exactly the opposite of what I expected, which is that divorce is less acceptable among young people in the general public than it is among older generations. So Muslim young people are actually more likely to accept divorce than non-Muslim young people. And this puzzled me and really surprised me. And then I looked in the literature, and here's what I found very interesting. This is a study conducted by the CDC, and they track this question. They've been tracking it for several decades. So what they found is this: results from 2002 to 2011 to 13. So this is over like a 10-year period. And the differences they found were this: there was an increase in the percentage of men and women who agreed with premarital cohabitation, non-marital childbearing, the right for gay and lesbian adults to adopt children, same-sex sexual relations, and premarital sex for those aged 18. So all of those things, people are more likely in 2011 to agree with them than they were in 2002. The one thing that they are less likely to agree with, there was a decrease in the percentage of men and women who agreed with divorce. So that's how the public trend is moving. Divorce is becoming more stigmatized, and all of these other things are becoming more normalized. And that is why in the general public, young people are less accepting of divorce than their elders. So I found that trend to be mind-blowing. The majority of Muslims do favor more support for divorced people in their faith community. So the question was, my faith community should be more supportive of divorced people. And 58% of Muslims agreed with that. And it's interesting that, that was basically across the board. Even among white evangelicals, 48% say that they believe that people should be more supported. Almost no difference really across all faith groups. The only one that stands out is the Jewish community, where only 38% say they want more support. But it's also true that the vast majority of Jewish people say divorce is acceptable. So it may just simply be that people are already supported, and being more, favoring more support maybe just isn't even an issue. And younger Muslims are more likely than their elders to favor greater support for divorced people. So here, 61% of young Muslims versus 46% of older Muslims favor support for more support for divorced people. In the general public, it's almost the same across the board. Really, there's not a huge drop when it comes to older generations. But it's interesting to see that this doesn't parallel acceptability of divorce. Young people are, in fact, slightly more young people in the Muslim community favor more support than see divorce as acceptable. So, it's possible to be as likely as your elders to accept divorce as a solution, but be more likely to want more support. So the two aren't necessarily synonymous. Now, Muslims are less likely than the general public, than Jews, and than non-affiliated people to accept to accept a divorced person as a spouse for their child. So the question was, if you had a son or daughter, how would you feel about them marrying? And then we had a list of different choices. One of them was a divorced person. 67% of Muslims said that they would have no problem with it, or they would, they'd be happy about it, or it would make no difference. Now, that's the majority, so it's not like, it's a small percentage, but they are less likely to hold this opinion than many other communities, including even the general public, with white evangelicals as the only community really less than Muslims in this regard. Here, I was surprised by the fact that there was no age difference. Young people and older people were equally likely to hold this opinion. It wasn't like young people were more accepting. There was, however, a race difference, which was sort of interesting, where Black and Arab Muslims were more accepting of a divorced person for a child's spouse, and white Muslims who identify as white, were the least accepting of this. And that's it for my presentation. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Dalia. Actually, that's a great reminder for folks who are joining us by Zoom, please feel free to put in your questions in the Q&A. You can also, if you're watching this on Facebook, you can also, in the questions there, I'll be tracking that if you wanted to place your questions there as well. And I'm going to just quickly share my screen as I introduce our next speaker. Can you guys hear me all right?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, my headphones just
decided to end their service with me today. My name, Rafee Al-Mansur received his master's in couples and family therapy from the University of Maryland and his bachelor's in sociology from Johns Hopkins University. Rafee is completing his residency in marriage and family therapy in a private practice under the supervision of Salma Al-Bijaderi, and he works with Muslims across a wide range of issues and populations, but has most experience working with married couples and male individuals ranging from adolescence to adulthood. Rafee is also a chair-elect of the Couple and Intimate Relationships Network of the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy. He also teaches a 6-week workshop on healthy communications and stress management for financial issues through the Together program. Again, please feel free to add your questions into the Q&A, and I'll be tracking it also on Facebook if you would like to add your questions there. And without further ado, Rafee, go ahead.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, so just to begin, I feel like I should do a full disclosure that I don't consider myself a specialized expert on divorce. I probably would consider myself an expert when it comes to relationships just by virtue of working with married couples. But in actuality, I'm trying to work with couples to try to prevent divorce. But at the same time, that's not always the outcome, and that's always not the best outcome or the favorable outcome. So I do have couples that have gotten divorced and have made that decision. As their marriage counselor, I kind of work with them up until that point. And so then what happened, because my client is the relationship, not either individual. So when the relationship, they did make the decision to end the relationship, my relationship as their therapist comes to an end too. So I don't necessarily see what happens after that. At the same time, I also do work with individuals that have gone through a divorce or are currently going through a divorce. So I also see them from their perspective, but I also don't see the full picture of what happened before they came to me. So just to give a little perspective on my experience working with in the issue of divorce. But on that note, though, I do, for the purpose of my talk, I thought that I would talk about how individuals can learn and grow from an experience of a divorce, specifically using emotions to guide us through that process. So just to start, marriages and similarly divorces are very complex and unique. I don't think there's any two marriages that are the same. And there's so many nuanced factors and history that go into a marital relationship that it can be hard to make generalizations about not just marriage, but also a process of divorce, because there are so many factors that get tied into it. And actually, I think that's one reason why divorce can be a hard topic or issue to find support around, is because there's just so much into it that it's hard to just even have a single cohesive narrative about, why a divorce happened or how either person came to that decision. And so it's hard to really get the support, because it's like, how do I catch everyone up to everything that's happened? And so that's one of the challenges. It really is only a few people outside of family that you probably feel that close to, that you've shared enough about it with. That being said, right, there are some just general kind of factors or trends or themes that come with divorce. And one of the common ways that divorce is looked at in terms of processing it is actually to look at it as a form of grieving or a form of grief. So, grief is when we lose a loved one to death. And so there's a lot of emotions that go with that. There's a process of mourning. And in some ways, a divorce is similar to that, because you're mourning actually quite a few things. You're not just mourning the loss of a loved one, right? Maybe it's not just a love, you have mixed feelings, but you are losing someone important to you. But also it's the loss of a lifestyle. It's the loss of certain hopes and visions that you had for your future. It's also a loss of a part of your own personal identity and how you view yourself or your roles. So there's a lot of losses that come with divorce that make it challenging. And divorce is actually even more complicated than a simple grief. There's what we call complicated grief, and there's uncomplicated grief. So, uncomplicated grief is kind of the standard process of grief that people will go through, and not that there's one kind of formula that everyone goes through, but when it comes to complicated grief, that's when the process of grieving becomes even more complicated. And it usually happens when the person that we're losing, and typically to death, is someone that we had mixed feelings around, right? It wasn't just maybe a happy and close and loving relationship. Maybe there were some, frustrations or angers or resentments or confusions or unmet kind of hopes in that relationship. And so when you lose that person to death, it's hard to honor all the emotions that come with that. And that's what makes grief even more difficult, because it feels like you can only really maybe do one, or you'll be compromising the other. So in many ways, divorce is kind of similar to that, because the reality of it is there's a real wide, vast variety of emotions that any person might feel when they go through divorce. Right? Even though I'm sure, there's always a lot of pain, there's also a history of good experiences too, right? Memories of happiness, right? Feelings of fulfillment, love, care and intimacy, joy, nostalgia, just connection and meaning that you shared with the person. And at the same time, there's probably a lot of feelings of just, loneliness and, deep sadness, frustration and anger, pain or anguish, and also, feelings of defeat or hopelessness. So there's all these emotions that sometimes feel like they're kind of at odds with each other or conflicting with each other. And that's what can make the process of achieving closure that much more difficult, because it's hard to navigate these seemingly contradictory feelings and thoughts. And so, when we're going through a process of divorce, we're usually torn internally, because we're usually going back, between these different parts of ourselves. One part that says, no, you should stay, you can make this work, there's so many good things about this relationship. And then another part that says, I'm just suffering so much, things aren't changing, this is really just killing me inside. And so you're already torn as you're going through it. And then, when you're going through the process of a divorce, it's usually you've kind of made it your decision that it's really not worth it for your well-being, or your partner doesn't think, or for their well-being or the relationship's well-being. And so as we're going through that process, we're creating a narrative about what's happening to us and what's happening to this marriage. The challenge is that it's hard to create a narrative that honors the full sweep of all those emotions, right? And so part of what I want to talk about here is being able to create a narrative that can actually be true and honest to all the different parts of yourself and what you're feeling, where it doesn't feel like you have to only honor one at the expense of the other. And I think that if we can actually, divorce can actually in that way be a really powerful healing as well as empowering process, right? Of knowing, of going through your own personal self-growth, as well as eventually preparing you for a new marriage, right? If that's something that at any point you want to pursue, right? To be able to work to that capacity too. So it helps with your personal growth, because being able to manage these different conflicting emotions isn't an easy task, but it's an important one. And it helps us to become more centered and true to ourselves, and really be at more peace and acceptance. And in terms of marital preparation, right, the journey of divorce and grief, right, is essentially an emotional one. And that emotions really play a very central role when it comes to marital conflict. When as part of that workshop that I teach, one of the slides I ask is, what do you guys think are some of the components of a healthy relationship? And almost every single time, the first point is communication. Right? Everyone says it's communication, and to the point where it's not even cliche. It's just, I think everyone recognizes how important healthy communication is, but we're not really taught what that looks like or how it should be. And so a lot of times we think it looks like just kind of talking at each other or to each other, but really what communication is being able to share the same perspective at the same time, where both individuals are understanding each other's lived experience. In order to do that, however, you have to really be in tune with your own lived experience. A lot of times we're not really in tune with what our emotions are and what we're feeling and why. Instead, we're seeing what's happening around us, and we're trying to kind of control the outside world. And that's more of an external locus of control, right? Instead, we want to focus more on being at a sense of awareness of our internal state, and then recognizing what our needs are from there, so we can communicate it. So in any case, I don't want to talk about communication or relationships. Really, I want to keep this focused on the experience of divorce and how that can help us. And so So to do that, because grieving is really an emotional process, we have to understand what the purpose of emotions are. Emotions aren't there just to kind of, wreak havoc on our lives, where we're feeling happy and excited in one moment, then just miserable and sad in another, and we're just kind of reacting to our emotions. Emotions actually have a purpose. The word emotion comes from a Latin word which means to move. And that's because the idea of emotions is that they're actually there to try to motivate us to some kind of a behavior or a response, or to reflect on something, to internalize something. They're trying to communicate something to us, but also push us to do something. So a lot of times we don't think of emotions in that way, where it's like, okay, what is this emotion trying to get me to do? Or what does it need to feel better? And that's really where I think, you know, just in general for any person, being more in tune and understanding emotions in that perspective can be really healthy and beneficial, but especially when it comes to going through a process of divorce, because of how challenging it is and how many emotions can come up. So I want to just talk about a few emotions, and maybe you can take it from there. So anger, right, is one of the common emotions that people feel. I'm sure it's also a very common one in divorces as well. So the purpose of anger is usually as a response to vulnerability and threat, where it seeks to try to protect vulnerability and neutralize a threat. Now, that's in a general sense. Now, in marriages, what I see the role of anger being is really, it's that part of us that tries to advocate for our needs, right? When we're not getting our needs met, or something's being violated, and we're not happy or at peace, our angry part comes up to try to compel us to speak on behalf of what we need, or to pursue what we need. And so it's actually not a bad thing, right? Anger is really there to take care of us. And this is true of all the emotions we have. Every emotion that we have is really there trying to preserve what's in our best interests. Now, in a divorce, right, sometimes the role of anger, it can help, it can serve to kind of reinforce our narrative of the wrongs that maybe our ex-spouses did to us or did to hurt us. And so sometimes anger can also kind of be a response to other feelings. So actually, I'll come back to that. So anger and resentment and blame, when this starts to happen, it really stems from an inability to really empathize and understand another person's actions and behaviors. So in this case, it's like your ex-spouse, right? When you can't understand someone, it becomes very easy to judge them, right? To just see what they did as being unacceptable and wrong. And so to let go of this anger, right, what this anger really needs to be able to let go is to have a level of empathy to another person's needs and their perspective. Unfortunately, that can sometimes be hard to do. And what often makes it hard is, on one level, it's not always clearly communicated what that other person is needing or feeling. And so another person might not always make it easy for us to understand. But also, there's sometimes I see in a lot of couples this fear that if I acknowledge my partner's needs, then I'm going to be compromising my own. And so this angry part of us is very reluctant to try to acknowledge that perspective, because it feels like I'm going to be losing something important to me if I do that. So that's one reason. And then another reason why it can be hard to have that level of understanding is that it can actually trigger a feeling of guilt or inadequacy on our own part, where suddenly we're feeling guilty, or we're feeling ashamed for something that we maybe feel insecure about. And so anger in this capacity becomes what we call a secondary emotion. So a primary emotion is like the first emotion that a situation will trigger. When something happens, this is our first response to that situation. A secondary emotion is an emotion that comes up in response to another emotion. So in a way, it's almost like a coping mechanism for a distressing feeling. So in this way, anger oftentimes, for a lot of people, comes up as a response to guilt or to shame. It's a way to kind of protect us from feeling that. And so we can slip into this pattern of falling into anger more so than is really good for us, because that feeling of guilt or, shame is something that is also a part of us. And so this is where I kind of go into the part of us trying to honor all of our emotions, where it doesn't have to be one or the other, where it's just the anger or just the guilt. So I'll talk briefly for a little bit about what the purpose of guilt is, and then we'll try to kind of bring it together. So guilt is a sense of violating our own values and ideals, right? That's what it's trying to communicate to us. And what it's trying to compel us to do is to act in accordance to our values, and also to take ownership of what we have done that's violated our values, to seek forgiveness, both from others as well as from ourselves, right? To forgive ourselves. And just to explain kind of the subtleness of emotions, right? That's guilt. Then we have regret. And so on the surface, it seems like these are almost the same, but regret, regret is actually, we feel regret when we do something, but at that time we weren't aware that we were violating our values, or it was beyond our control, right? So something where we didn't actually intentionally cross a line of ours that we knew we shouldn't cross. So this is more of us wishing that we had done something differently to have prevented an outcome, but it's not a sense of that we've actually violated a personal value of ourselves. And so what regret needs is more a sense of acceptance and learning from the experience, rather than maybe, acknowledging that we've maybe done some wrong to our own selves. So I want to kind of tie this back, right? So oftentimes when it does come to divorce, right, people will feel a sense of sometimes even like failure, or like I didn't do enough, or maybe this is my fault, or basically feeling a sense of responsibility. And it can be hard to live with that. At the same time, we can't deny what we're feeling when we're feeling that our needs weren't being met. So rather than react to denial and defensiveness when we do feel that guilt, what I tell couples when they're going through a divorce is really honor all the feelings that come up for you, right? Don't try to fight any emotion. And if an emotion comes up, sit with it, listen to it, try to understand what it's telling you, and don't be afraid of it. Because in a way, emotions are self-correcting, which means if you allow yourself just to sit with it for a little bit, then it'll naturally push you to the place of healing, of where you need to go. But it's when we resist it or deny it or try to block it out that those emotions start kind of pounding louder, because they're not feeling heard, they're not feeling understood. So when it comes to the feelings of maybe responsibility, and trying to create a narrative that honors all the perspectives, part of what's really needed to heal is to accept one's own role, and maybe not meeting the needs or expectations that your partner had, while also acknowledging that doesn't deny that you also had your own expectations and your own needs that you needed. Both of these can be true, and it's really just a matter of balancing them both. One thing that a couple once told me is that, which I really like, they live by this principle of you can at most take 50% blame, but you take 100% responsibility, which means that at the end of the day, you're both entitled to a marriage that you want, of how you want it to look. And it's not about who's right, whose expectations are more real. It's that you both have your own expectations and you're both entitled to them. But you also take on full responsibility of what you are entitled to. So that's kind of what I really try to encourage people when they're going through a divorce, is not to try to slip into a narrative of blame, of who's at fault or who's not, but to try to see it more of a perspective of differences in needs and expectations. And in that sense, also seeing, right, where there is a part of you that says that this is a place where maybe I didn't meet, or I wasn't as reliable to my partner as maybe I thought I was. That's okay, right? That's not the whole part of the story. And you can balance that while also balancing the reality that, your partner maybe really did have certain issues or problems that they weren't able to work past. At the end of the day, you guys both tried your best and came to this decision, and to find a way to accept that this is what you're at peace with and what was really best for you. Now, the last emotion I want to talk about before I finish is the emotion of grief itself. So grieving is a process, but grief is also an emotion. And so grief is like an intense form of sadness, which represents a loss. And it's a loss of something of value or of meaning to you. And so when we feel that, what that grief is trying to compel us to do is actually to create new value and meaning in your life. And until you are able to do that, that feeling of grief actually isn't going to go away. And so that's really actually an important part of the process at some point. So, when it comes to the loss of your personal identity, right? Now it's a matter of creating new identity, meanings of your own identity, right? Of what your roles are. Maybe finding a new role or finding little things in your lifestyle or routine that are meaningful to you. It could be little things just to start, buying yourself something nice, going out for a walk, as well as, creating traditions. I always say creating traditions and routines is another great thing, and rediscovering your own, your identity as an individual. It's also creating new hopes and visions for a future for yourself. And also eventually, right, is to really to find and create new relationships, whether that's a marriage or whether that's something else, whether that's your relationship with Allah, right? It's creating meaning in relationships that you have with others. And that's what the grief is trying to compel us to do. Okay, so that's the full talk that I had.
Thank you so much, Rafee. So I actually wanted to jump into some of the questions now because a few of them Dalia already answered via the chat, but I think that there's a few that perhaps we could address right now. One of the questions is, can we get a recording of this session? Inshallah, if you're registered through the Zoom link, you will be given a copy of it. Also, I've put a link in the chat where you can sign up to receive one if you just want to double check. And then I'll also include that on the Facebook Live recording, so you can sign up there as well. The first question we have is, I'm going to interpret it a little bit, but when parents are not supportive of a child who is divorced or is going through a divorce, and the question is specifically about a daughter, what are steps that divorced woman can take to find better support?
Okay, so is this, I'm trying to interpret it, so when parents are not supportive, I'm wondering if this is a daughter that's already divorced and maybe another parent for their marriage, or is it wanting to get a divorce?
I think if we could answer the question as if it's a person going through a divorce or having been divorced and they're not feeling supported by their parents around them.
Okay. And I imagine this is a question for Sister Dalia. You can answer as well, as much as you'd like. So I guess for me, finding definitely systems of support are really important, and it's not always easy. But finding whether it's it's a friend, a sibling, right? It's hard because you have your own, again, like your own feelings and your own reality, and sometimes, right, our parents might not be supportive of that or might be invalidating to that, and so then that really doesn't help us to kind of resolve those feelings. So finding a safe place to talk about it, it could be in the form of therapy, or really a close confidant or friend. Yeah, and really, I know relationships with parents can be really kind of strained, where sometimes, I've seen a lot of clients, their parents aren't really open to understanding their perspective or listening to them, and it's hard to navigate that. One of the key pieces of communication that is true of all relationships is really just the element of validation. And so when your parents share something that you don't agree with, it's hard sometimes because there's a lot of emotions tied with it, but to be able to just show them that you're hearing what they're saying, that you understand their concerns. Usually once one person feels understood, then they're more willing to try to listen and understand the other.
Thank you. I'll take one more question before we introduce our final speaker. And this one is, I guess, what is the number one or even the number two cause of divorce within Muslim communities? And I don't know, Dalia, if you addressed this or if the report talks about this specifically.
Yeah, so the report that we put out several years ago called Recommendations for Promoting Healthy Marriages and Preventing Divorce in the American Muslim Community actually outlines the top reasons for divorce in the Muslim American community. And what you'll find in the report is they're very similar to the general public. So things like conflicts over money, conflict over parenting style, infidelity. So we have all of the same problems as the general public, and then we have some additional ones that are unique to our community, namely in-laws. So in-laws cause divorce in the Muslim American community, conflicts with in-laws, much more than they do in the general public. So unfortunately, we have all of the things that cause divorce in the general public. We aren't missing any of them. Plus, we have the issue of in-laws as an additional one.
Thank you. Yeah, and actually, as I finish introducing Dr. Tahseen, I'll add a link to an infographic that discusses kind of the relationship with in-laws that the FYI has put out a number of years ago. So I'll include that in the chat and on Facebook Live as well. Thank you so much. And we'll get to the other questions towards the end of the talk. But right now, I'd like to introduce Dr. Tahseen. Give me 1 second as I share my screen. All right. So not her name. Dr. Madiha Tahseen is a research fellow, community educator, and she's also the research translation manager at the Family and Youth Institute. She holds a PhD in applied developmental psychology from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Dr. Tahseen's research interests include individual and group identity development, parenting, acculturation, and risk and protective factors of Muslim adolescents' healthy development. She has presented her research nationally in both academic and community settings. She's been a community organizer for more than a decade, serving the American Muslim community in varying capacities. And without further ado, Madiha, I'm gonna go ahead and pass the presentation on to you.
Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Jazakallah for joining us today and kind of hanging in there on a Saturday. I know the one thing we want to do is kind of be with family. But as you've already heard, this is definitely a topic that really requires a lot of support, inshallah. So Jazakallah khair for being here. So I wanted to wrap up, inshallah, today's talks with sort of taking a research approach to what the community needs, and then kind of concluding with some resources that are available for everyone, inshallah. So I will be sharing my screen. We'll get started. I think I have to. Sorry, having some connectivity issues here. Okay, so inshallah, as you've heard, you've heard of sort of what the public perception of the stigma is, as well as what clients are facing, and in terms of what supports them when they reach out for services. So what we wanted to do was kind of take, step back and ask the question is, what does the community need? What do people need when they're struggling? So we conducted a needs assessment to kind of answer these questions. And then out of that needs assessment came a divorce toolkit that I wanted to share with everybody today, inshallah. So I'll walk through the needs assessment first, inshallah, and then we'll go into the divorce toolkit. So what did we do? Essentially, what we did is we did a three-pronged approach to what does the community need. Our approach was to conduct research, to talk to the experts, and to hear from the community directly, which is you guys. In terms of research, what we did is we looked at all of the empirical research that's out there. So these are the academic journals, the research that's been conducted by other experts in the field about marriage and about struggles with marriage as well as divorce, both for Muslim couples as well as non-Muslim couples. So we kind of wanted to see what does the research say in terms of what couples are sort of struggling with. We also then conducted interviews with professionals from different backgrounds. So this is both religious leaders as well as therapists from different backgrounds to understand what are clients struggling. So exactly sort of what you've heard from Brother Rafee on this webinar today. So what are sort of clients experiencing on the ground, both in therapeutic sessions as well as community sessions with religious leaders. And then our final step was to kind of take this information and put together an online survey that was administrated, that was sort of sent out to our FYI community, and to see what are the needs that are identified by those struggling with divorce, as well as those who know someone that's struggling with divorce. And so I'll kind of walk through some of the findings that we had primarily from our online survey, inshallah. So the online survey that was conducted was for, we had respondents, about 387 American Muslims who completed the survey between October and December 2018. Our audience on that survey was primarily under 50 years of age, with about roughly 90% between their 20s and their 40s. We had mostly females, for sure. We only had about 20% response from males. And then in terms of the ethnic racial makeup, it's primarily Asians and Arabs. The reason I'm mentioning this is, one, to just kind of caution everyone that there are limitations to sort of this data that we are presenting. It doesn't really accurately reflect the experience of divorce in other ethnic and racial groups, as well as certain age groups, and then of course the experience of males. So it's just important to keep that in mind as we kind of talk about these findings sort of preliminarily. So the first thing that we found was that 82% of the respondents stated that they know someone who has gone through divorce and needs more resources to navigate the process. What this number really shows is that, you know, we think this is something that's kind of happening in, you know, someone else's family. It's happening somewhere else. It's not our community. It's not our couples. And as you can see by this number, this is something that's really very relevant and very prevalent. Of course, we need a lot more, you know, rigorous research to understand this further. But the fact that 82% of those 387 respondents said they know someone that's been through this, it's a really good indicator of how prevalent this really is and how much we really do need to provide support and resources for individuals that are trying to navigate this process. Our next question was, you know, what kind of resources do you think people need? And this is, our respondents were both, in terms of their marital status, they were a mix of all the different statuses. So we had respondents who were divorced themselves. We had respondents who were remarried, we had respondents who were single, and then we had respondents who were also well married. So when we ask all of them, what kind of resources do you think would be helpful in what you've seen either yourself or in loved ones that you've helped through this process, this is the response we got. So spirituality, stigma, the impact of divorce on one's mental health, the remarriage process, and then recognizing abuse in the relationship. So I'll dig into this a little bit further just so that you get a picture of what sort of is the most important. So when it comes to relationships and abuse, you know, 80% of respondents said they wanted a better understanding of how to recognize an unhealthy relationship. Conflict is very healthy, right? But respondents wanted to know, how do you know when that conflict becomes unhealthy and becomes, you know, abuse? What's really interesting and sort of a common misperception is that men don't experience abuse, right? Or that men are the perpetrators of abuse. 95% of the male respondents also recognized that they needed more resources about abuse in relationships. Again, small sample size of males, so something to keep in mind, but it was still interesting that the majority of them said this was still an important topic to recognize and get resources on. When it comes to your own mental health, 77% of respondents said they wanted more resources on divorce and mental health. Of those, 71% wanted help with coping after a divorce. Children, of course, as you imagine, are a big sort of factor that needs to be navigated. So it's completely understandable that 80% of respondents mentioned that they wanted more resources on how to help children through a divorce. And then remarriage, right? As much as we think there is stigma around divorce, and that, you know, once this happens, you know, you're marked and that's it. The data kind of show the opposite. 59% of individuals said they were looking for more resources with the remarriage process. If you dig into that a little bit, you know, 75% indicated they wanted more resources on preparing for marriage. What's the marriage prep process that they didn't engage in the first time after they've experienced a divorce? So what these findings really show us is that, you know, this issue is very prevalent, as I'm sure you've already heard many times before, but it's now time to provide these resources that our community needs as they struggle with these issues. You know, the stigma is within us, so we have to start by erasing that stigma, to erase that stigma by providing the support. And so what can we do, inshallah? With that sort of in mind, the FYI created this Divorce Toolkit. It's an online toolkit that's available to everyone that has resources, whether you're in, you know, still just kind of thinking about it, you have no idea if it's really what you want to do, or if you're, you know, way past the divorce stage and you're thinking about remarriage. So what I'd like to do is really sort of walk you through the toolkit to show you what the resources are there so that you can kind of apply them to whatever your unique situation might be, inshallah. What you'll notice, I just wanted to show you really quickly before I take you over to the online toolkit, is the toolkit is set up in stages, as I just said. So each section is kind of different stages. So section 1, which is contemplating divorce, is, as I said, you know, a lot of couples are at the point where, you know, it's not even a question. They're not even thinking about divorce. An individual, and it might just be one person in the relationship, right, who's like, well, you know, we're having so much conflict, we keep fighting, I don't know what to do. You know, they're just kind of thinking about it. So there's that stage. So there's resources about that. And then if you're in the middle of it, in the heart of, you know, the different legal processes, what do you need to be thinking about? And then after you've sort of completed the divorce, what are some things to think about? And so all these stages, as you guys will see on the toolkit, inshallah. Also, if you are not someone experiencing this yourself, but you want to support a sibling or a loved one, you know, a friend, a community member, there's a section in there, inshallah, as well, about what things you need to be thinking about. So I'll kind of walk you through those sort of quickly. But one thing I wanted to highlight is in each of these stages, the issues kind of are the same, right? You have to think about mental health. You have to think about, or you will be thinking about sort of your relationship with the partner, right? With your ex or with your current spouse. You'll be thinking about children. And so the toolkit is set up to kind of address these issues, but depending on whatever stage that you're at. So I'm gonna walk you over sort of virtually to the toolkit. So this is a FYI's toolkit. If you just go to the FYI.org and you go to education, there's a tab on there for toolkit. You click on that and you will find the FYI's Divorce Support Toolkit.
I also, just so you guys know, I linked it in the chat and it's also available on the Facebook Live thread.
Perfect, thank you, Sarah.
You're still sharing the PowerPoint, not the website.
Oh, thank you. Let me.
I think unshare your screen and then reshare it to your Chrome.
Okay. Is that good?
Perfect.
Yes. Thank you, Dalia, for that. I appreciate that. Every time you think you figured it out, there's always something new. So I'll just kind of repeat what I said. So you just go to the FYI.org. You can follow the link that Sarah posted. You come to education, and then come to toolkits. So this is the Divorce Toolkit. These are the different sections that we have. So let's say, I'm gonna use random names here, right? Let's say you're Mariam and Bilal, right? And Mariam is really struggling. She feels like she's been going through a lot of conflict in her relationship. She just can't get through to Bilal. They've been fighting a lot. Bilal thinks there's no problem, but Mariam's like, this can't be what like healthy marriage looks like. I am not happy and this is not making sense. So some things that she can think about is sort of to really step back and assess your marriage. So we've got resources on here of what you can be thinking about when you're just you yourself are assessing your relationship. There are assessments that you can be thinking about, sort of marriage workability quizzes. Some people also think about, once, let's say Mariam's gone to Bilal after doing her sort of internal assessment and said, hey, this is something that we really need to work on. If Bilal happens to agree, right, they can think about something like a healing separation. So you can look at the toolkit for more information on these different parts that you can take, right? It's not necessary that the second you kind of come to this decision that our relationship is not working, the next step is automatically divorce. There are other options that are there to pursue. And so the toolkit has this section where you can kind of think through that, whether it's a healing separation. Some couples also consider discernment counseling. So it's just something to think about for you to sort of look into more if you're really not there yet. If you are a couple that's considering divorce, so let's, again, back to Mariam and Bilal. Let's say Mariam goes to Bilal and both, they both kind of agree, hey, things aren't working, we need to think about something else. They might come to this section about leaning towards a divorce, right? And go through some of these resources about just the questions that you need to be thinking about, signs that you need to be looking for to see, to understand your relationship. Let's say Mariam and Bilal do have this conversation and they decide, hey, I don't think, really that divorce or separation is the next step for us. Let's see if we can kind of work on a relationship. So there's a section here about reconciling your relationship and what are some things that you might want to try before giving up on your marriage. What are some exercises and activities that you can engage in to strengthen that relationship? It's also really important to think about the conflict that exists in your relationship. So as I mentioned, conflict is very healthy, right? That helps us grow. It helps us kind of get to the bottom of our issues. But of course, that conflict can take a more significant form when it becomes abuse in your relationship. So there's a section in here, if you think that you might be struggling with abuse, let's say you're also not even ready to label it that, right? There is a section here on what are some signs that you need to be thinking about, what are some things you need to look at, whether it's signs of gaslighting or what does an unhealthy and abusive relationship look like. So you can check out this section to kind of think about, how does this apply to your relationship and if you are experiencing some of these signs or not. Recognizing again that domestic abuse does happen to men as well. So there are some resources there to think through. And then of course, the big stigma we have sort of unfortunately in our community about abuse in Islam and the concept that you just have to be patient and just hang in there. So there are a lot of resources that a lot of Muslim organizations, alhamdulillah, have put together about, how abuse is not a part of our religion and how Islam promotes justice, and that comes through in healthy relationships. So I would really encourage you to check out this section as well if that's something that you think is sort of what's going on in what you're facing in your relationship. And so then final thing that you might want to think about if you are just kind of contemplating divorce is children, right? So being able to understand how divorce impacts children, how you might want to talk to them about it. This common concept that a lot of couples I've seen where they say, well, should we just we'll just stay together for the kids. There's no way a divorce is going to be good for the kids. So they kind of hang in there for the kids. So it's really important to understand, what does that really mean? And what impact does that really have when children are seeing the conflict in your relationship constantly? So I would encourage you to check out this section if you want to learn more about that, to kind of answer that question for yourself. So that's the section on sort of contemplating divorce. Now let's say we're going to forget Mariam and Bilal, right? Let's do another couple. Let's talk about, Adam and Aya, for example, right? Now let's say they've decided it is time for them to move into a divorce. They've tried discernment counseling or they've tried talking to an imam in the community and it's just not working, right? So they move forward. During this process, a lot of times we kind of get busy and wrapped up in sort of the legal part of things, right? The lawyers, the figuring out sort of the financial piece of it. So it's really easy to kind of neglect other parts. And so what this toolkit does in this section is really help you focus on those other things that are really easy to let go of. So, self-care, interacting with your partner during this time, and soon to be ex-partner, And then of course, children, if that's your reality. So this section just has, as you're kind of experiencing a loss of control, you might be experiencing anxiety, you might be experiencing a lot of anger, how can you kind of deal with those emotions and make sure that you kind of come out of this process in a way that's really focused on your growth. So I would encourage you to check out this section to learn a lot more about that and what you can do to sort of cope during this time. And then naturally, you're obviously having to interact with your partner throughout the divorce. And so for some people, that might not be a positive interaction, right? That's the entire reason you're kind of getting this divorce in the first place. So this section kind of goes through how to have somewhat of a healthy communication style, how to have a more collaborative divorce, how to have a more friendly divorce with sort of low conflict, and just kind of tactics and techniques you can try to sort of mitigate and reduce some of that conflict you might be experiencing during this time. And then also thinking about abuse again, and what does abuse look like, and some of the stigma you might be facing about from other people about maybe you should have tried more, was it really abuse? And so it's really important to make sure that you are educated yourself, but also can pass on these resources to loved ones about abuse in Islam. And then finally, the last section just goes through, again, children. So now that you are talking about divorce, right, you're going to be thinking about how to inform your children. One key thing to remember is children are in different developmental ages. So it's really important that you talk about divorce in a way that makes sense for your child, whether it's an elementary schooler or a teenager or even a college student. And then, so recognizing what that communication needs to look like, but then also knowing how divorce impacts children differently at different ages. So there's resources on here to kind of help you answer some of those questions for yourselves. There's books about divorce that you can share with children, activities and things like that. Your other priority might be to think about your environment, right? And how to interact with your partner in a way that's healthy for your children. So this section of the toolkit also kind of goes into resources about how to navigate this process for your children so that they really come out of it as resilient. It doesn't have to be a negative process for children. It absolutely doesn't. There are things that you can do to really build your children's resilience throughout this time. And also how to reduce conflict with your partner for their sake. So a lot of this section kind of goes into those questions. I'm not going to fully in detail sort of go through the other sections, but it's the same concept, right? So a big thing about after divorce that's different from previous stages is, you're faced with a new reality, right? Who am I after this divorce? Now I used to be one of a couple, now I'm an individual unit, right? So who am I? And so coping with that breakup and dealing with the healing is really, really important. And so we incorporated a section in here about how can you think about coping with the stress after divorce, but how do you find yourself? How do you set healthy boundaries with your ex-spouse to come up with this new reality that you're in? How can you think about forgiveness or acceptance? How can you use this time that you're now alone as a tool for reflection and really come out of it in a way that you're thinking about in terms of healing and thriving as this new person after divorce? And so this section really kind of walks you through different strategies and tips that you can use to sort of meet that goal and to kind of shift your mind a little bit. If you are coming out of an abusive relationship, there's a section on here for how you can kind of heal yourself from an abusive relationship. So you can check out that section. And then of course, children, right? So how to think about co-parenting and how to have healthy parenting relationship with your ex for the sake of children, and how to really have a healthy home environment. And if you're talking about two homes, what does that need to look like and how do you navigate that? So this toolkit has sections on that, inshallah. In the interest of time and just to make sure we do have time for questions, the other toolkit, again, follows the same sort of process. If you're thinking about remarriage, how do you want to think about when it comes to readiness for marriage? How do you think about sort of healing from your previous marriage? How do you balance children and step parenting, and some additional resources that you can think about. So you can check out this section for the toolkit if that's sort of where you're at. And then we do have a small section here One of the things that was really interesting in our needs assessment was there was a request for resources about sort of what's called gray divorce. So a lot of us that are sort of, you know, the sandwich, actually, sorry, not the sandwich generation, but a lot of us who are sort of in our 30s, you know, might have parents now who are going through divorce. You know, the empty nesters, once the children leave the home, that's when you kind of decide, okay, this is not working for us. So that's kind of called a gray divorce. And so if you are experiencing this for your parents, this might be a section that you can sort of check out in terms of what might be helpful for you to navigate this process. And then also if you're in the heart of this yourself, then you can also just check out some resources here. We have a section on finances in terms of just sort of how to educate yourself on your own finances, how to empower yourself so you don't feel sort of blindsided by all of the legality of this entire process. One thing you also want to do is be able to just make sure you really refine your financial skills, whether you are from a dual income household or not. Having strong financial skills is really, really key to protect yourself. So this section kind of goes into a lot of that information. And then finally, as I mentioned at the beginning, right, you might be somebody that isn't experiencing it yourself, but let's say you've got a friend or a sibling that is going through this process. So we have this section here just to kind of provide some resources if you would like to support somebody going through this process. If you are marrying somebody that was a divorcee, right, so there's a section on here on how, you know, what you need to think about in terms of your relationship, what you might be seeing in this person, and how to sort of navigate that process for them. If you are someone that's married to somebody that's a survivor of abuse, or if you are a community member, or if you've heard, you know, somebody sort of disclosed abuse to you, what can you do? So there are sections on here about that. I mean, also in generally, as I said, stigma starts with the community. So we need to reduce stigma in the community. So there's some resources in here about what we can do to think about reducing some of that stigma in the community as a whole. And then finally, just the last section, sort of just additional resources, as well as some excellent organizations that you can reach out to for additional support, as well as online support groups. So I will end there, inshallah. I just really encourage everyone, I think whether you are listening because you have a loved one going through this process, or you are someone yourself going through this process or thinking about this process, divorce is a very, very difficult thing. The stigma is there because of essentially kind of how difficult it can be, but it doesn't have to be that way. With resources, you can try to navigate this process and come out of it in a way that helps you sort of really grow and thrive as an individual, inshallah, and trust in Allah's will for what He's planned for you. Jazakallah khair.
Jazakallah khair, Madiha. Thank you so much. I will go ahead and before we jump into the questions, I did want to share a few of the resources that we've been talking about, and I did want to share just where you can find the different speakers. Rafee, if you could let people know how they can find you as well. I was able to gather the information for ISPU and the FYI, but I'm sorry, I didn't get it from you. I didn't get it for you. Give me one second here. You can go ahead and tell people if you would like to while I'm doing this.
Sure. Yeah, so my our website for our practice is wellnessthroughcounseling.com. So that over there you can get in touch with me either through sending me a message, or my phone number is there as well. We also have other therapists there. And then for those of you in the DMV, just looking for therapists in general, there's a great resource called muslimcounselors.org, where we have a list of the different Muslim mental health providers in the area. So you can kind of see, not all of them are there, but a good number of them are. And there's also the Institute of Muslim Mental Health. They also have a resource list of different therapists throughout the area. And I believe on the toolkit, there's links to different mental health resources there as well.
Yeah, I think all of the ones that you mentioned are linked in the additional resources section of the toolkit, so you can find them there. this is where you can find the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I did want to just highlight the report that Dalia was talking about. This is not the report where the recent statistics are from. That will be coming out shortly. This is the report. It's a full report on recommendations for promoting healthy marriages and preventing divorce in the American Muslim community. Here's a slide for the Family and Youth Institute. And this is our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I believe we were having a live chat of this webinar on our Instagram. So if you wanted to go back and ask questions or just interact or engage with the story, you're welcome to do that there. And then the toolkit that we were talking about is right here. It's the Divorce Support Toolkit. We've recently also published, or Dr. Tahseen has published an article to kind of go along with the toolkit that fleshes it out in a more of a narrative way. So there's that. Let's go back to questions. Let's see here. So, mashallah, we had a bunch come in just recently, but this is a question somebody asked. Why do some people seem to not need therapy after a divorce compared to other people who seem to need to? And maybe Rafee, if you would like to answer that.
Sure. So, I mean, people find different ways of, I think, probably coping with their experience. So it's not that you necessarily need to have therapy after a divorce. I think people, again, it's just a matter of being in tune with yourself and knowing how you can kind of manage and carry yourself. Different people, it affects them to different extents. Yeah, is there any other part to that question? Or, yeah.
Yeah, not really. It was just kind of the caveat was some people get married again without therapy and seem to have a perfectly fine marriage and a very long marriage afterwards. And that was a commentary after.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I think remarriage it can definitely, getting divorced doesn't mean you can't get remarried and can't have a successful and healthy relationship. You don't need to, again, I think, have therapy, but it is important. I think a lot of times divorce does clarify for you what's important, right? It's hard to kind of, I think, go through a divorce and then not be wary of some of the same patterns or issues that you first saw, right? And a lot of times, right, that's where we realize what's important to us. And so we can kind of approach another marriage with that in mind. And just also, that being said, I would discourage just jumping straight into another relationship, right? I think you should go through a process of really grieving and coming to a place of understanding and closure, so that way you can also understand what you need and your own personal areas of growth.
Thank you. Dalia, I don't know if the report talks about this, but one person asked, what percentage of second marriages for American Muslims are successful and lasting?
That's a question we don't have a number on. But I do see that there's so many questions about the details of like rate of divorce for the first marriage, second marriage. So, I've noted that, and inshallah we'll add that to future surveys. So we have a concrete number for that.
Thank you. And another question, how do you know when the conflict is unhealthy? And they asked if you can explain more specifically. So I don't know if either Madiha or Rafee, if you want to attempt that one.
Sure, I'll jump in. So, I mean, conflict is still uncomfortable, right? I think most people tend to be conflict averse. Actually, no, I can't even say that. Some people, they would rather have conflict than no communication or engagement at all. But there's just usually a lot that goes into it. You can hear kind of one side of a story and see it one way, and then I have this often where I work whenever I see a new couple, I'll usually try if I have time to talk to each couple on the phone beforehand. And so I'll talk to one partner and I'll hear one side and I'll think, okay, like my mind is buzzing one way. And then a couple of days later, I'll talk to the other partner and I hear it from an entirely different perspective. And so it's the reality of it is you can have two very different perspectives, but they're both feeding into each other. And almost all marital conflicts are cycles, right? That we're usually responding to our partner's behaviors, where we see them do something and it affects us, and then we respond in a way and it affects them, and over time it goes on. But if you're if you're not in a place where you can actually really resolve issues, where you can talk about problems and get to a place of closure and of understanding and then resolution of what to do, and that's not a healthy place to be. For symptoms or themes to look out for, this is called there's a scholar named John Gottman who looked at different types of patterns in relationships, and he identified what he called the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, which essentially say that if you have these 4 qualities, then your relationship has a very low likelihood of surviving long term. So having them doesn't mean that you're doomed, but you do have to work to get them, remove them. He was actually able to predict divorce to something like a 98% accuracy level with this. So the 4 patterns in general are, the first one's criticism. So criticism is when we make kind of like a character attack, when we call like our partner like selfish or any kind of negative label, or we say you always do this, or you never do that. Things that honestly most people probably do just when they get frustrated. But that's different from what's called a critique, which is when you focus on the behavior itself, a specific behavior, rather than kind of a general character label. Because then when people hear that, you're kind of attacking their sense of self. And so they then, this leads to the second symptom, which is defensiveness, where they try to defend their behavior themselves while simultaneously justifying an attack on you. Like, well, if you didn't do this or you didn't do that, then I wouldn't have to do this, or something like that. So it goes into this cycle, and then that just leads to a fight. You're left feeling like nothing gets resolved. Over time, these kind of frustrations and disappointments grow into the third symptom, which is called contempt, which I like to think of this as like a cousin of resentment, where you start to really look down on your partner. You see them as being kind of less than you, and you really kind of have this disdain or kind of disgust towards them. And it comes out in the things that you say, and just a lack of respect, and really just any kind of positive feelings towards them. And then the fourth symptom is what's called stonewalling. So this is when a partner will just kind of completely check out or not respond to their partner when they try to engage with them. And that is in a way that partner trying to regulate their own emotions, but by not engaging, because if they engage, they're going to get really angry, or it's going to turn into a big fight. But it's extremely frustrating for the other partner. And it's extremely, so it's hard for them to be in that type of relationship where they're left feeling, lonely and unheard, and so those are kind of 4 things to look out for, I'd say.
Excellent, thank you very much. Just keeping in mind the time. Madiha, did you have something to add? Sorry,
yeah, just very quickly. I just wanted to add, in addition to Rafee's excellent commentary, is just that relationships are very different from couple to couple. So oftentimes we're looking for a blueprint, right? Like if someone can just tell me A, B, C, what abuse looks like, let me just see if I can check it off, right? And that is never going to be the case, right? The signs that you need to be looking for, it really varies, because who you are as a person varies, and then who you are in that relationship with this other person is also different. So I would really encourage everybody, in addition to Gottman's work that Rafee talked about, which is also in the toolkit, is to look up their resources and see what part kind of applies to you in your unique relationship, and then look at it that way as well. So just wanted to kind of add that extra layer to it.
Excellent, thank you. We've had a couple of questions dealing with finances, if this kind of steers in the direction of fiqh, I think we'll kind of steer away from it, because none of us are necessarily Islamic scholars. But one person asked, how can a Muslim deal with the financial division with the differences in U.S. law versus Islamic law? I guess anybody.
I don't want to answer that question because I'm not a religious scholar, but I do want to say there are a couple of resources we've linked in the finance section that does go into some of those finances questions I've seen. I just don't want to speak to it personally because it's not my background. So I would just encourage you guys to check out that in the finances section.
Yeah, and I know like with divorce being such a kind of multifaceted issue, it's not just a, emotional, you're not only going for emotional counseling, you're also dealing with finances, you're also dealing with Islamic law. And so you will be needing to look for kind of experts in these different fields to get your specific answer, specific questions answered. And I wonder, Rafee, if there's, I'm imagining that people come to you with questions like this, that you're not necessarily, qualified on an Islamic law front. What do you suggest to them when they're asking these questions?
Yeah, that's a great point and question. So yeah, if it's coming to the point of divorce, and that's where the questions are really around. This is something I got from my supervisor, Salma Bajadiri. She said she always recommends that if you're contemplating divorce, contact an attorney and contact an imam. And these are two people that you should, even if you're not entirely sure that you want to, but you're seriously considering it, just so you understand all the things that are kind of tied into it, and that way you can make an educated decision. That way you're also not doing things that could be, jeopardizing your position in the future or later on. So that's usually what I'll do and I'll recommend.
Excellent, thank you. I think we have time just for one more question. Our speakers do need to jump off exactly at 4:30, so I don't want to take up too much of their time. But if you could talk a little bit about what's the best way to find premarital Islamic counseling. Is there a way for a couple to do this who's about to get married? And everybody's looking for things online right now. So if that could be addressed, and then we'll close, inshallah.
Sure. So I know that the FYI also has an excellent toolkit on if you're considering getting married. I don't remember what that's called, but
yeah, the marriage prep toolkit. Yeah, so that has some resources there as well. I can add that into the chat.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent toolkit. As far as marriage counseling and premarital counseling, definitely any kind of, most couples therapists will provide that. So you can, the same places you would go to look for just marriage counseling, those therapists can provide that. I know a lot of imams do it too, and different imams have different kinds of like structured programs where they kind of go through a list of different issues from the things that they've seen. So that's also another, I think, excellent resource to consider. And there's different books too. One thing that I recommend couples to do is to read through some of the Islamic kind of premarital books, and just kind of read one chapter at a time, you and your potential spouse, and then have a discussion on the chapter, maybe week to week.
Excellent, thank you so much. There were a number of questions that we didn't get answered. I'm going to be keeping them, inshallah, and we'll try to somehow figure out a way to answer them. If you've asked a question that hasn't been answered, if you could email info@thefyi.org, info@thefyi.org. We will try to get an answer for you. It may not be one that our speakers here would necessarily be able to answer, because a number of them are more fiqh related, or jurisprudence related. So we'll inshallah be trying to get those answered for you. I'd like to thank our speakers, Dalia Mogahed, Rafee Al-Mansur. Oh.
So I just saw a message from Dr. Anisa.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
She has a program called Before the Nikah. It's a marriage preparation program that's available by Zoom starting September 14th.
Perfect.
So, yeah, Anisa Nadir, Aneesah.
Yes, and yes, and actually, Dr. Nadir, if you wanted to send another question with the link, I can add it to the chat before we close, inshallah. And I'll add it to the Facebook thread as well if this ends before. And I guess with please check out the research that's available at ispu.org and also at thefyi.org for a number of different resources on this topic. I also added Rafee's information in the chat, and I'll be including it on the Facebook Live thread as well. So without further ado, I'd like to thank all of you very much for joining us today. again, like Madiha said, it's a Saturday. It's not such an easy time. We're hoping to get the recording out to folks who registered, and the program will be available on our Facebook page as well. Jazakallah khair for everybody for joining us, and we'll talk to you soon, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.